Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guests are Caroline Lane, Managing Director of AuditStar, and Manuel Reyes, founder and CEO of Cortex Media. Both run two leading media consultancies. Caroline, Manuel, welcome to the show. We're so delighted to have you here, and you're talking about a topic that's on a lot of people's minds. So please welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, well, look, before we delve into some of the trends and the specifics of the media inflation outlook, would you talk a little bit about your collaboration on this global report and what it means to marketers? I know you two have known each other, dare I say, for decades, but it would be interesting to just hear that in relation to the report.
Go ahead.
Well, I think this is something that we've talked about for a while. I mean, Manuel and I have known each other for, dare I say, more than 20 years, but we were talking about this recently, and I think Manuel and his team also came up with the idea that it would be a nice idea to have a deeper dive into this whole media inflation topic, which is highly debated, highly contentious, and almost no one ever aligns on it.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, we have been also involved with the WFA, compiling their numbers and helping them get the report out. And here in the U.S., for better or worse, but we're becoming sort of like one of the sources for inflation figures and so forth. And we'll talk about this more, but there's a lot of confusion as to what inflation should be for media and how it should be defined even. So I think we can have a good productive conversation that hopefully sheds some light on the report that we just created.
Now, that's wonderful. I mean, when you use words like confusion and highly contentious, it sounds like we're going to have a bit of a fiery conversation, although I have a feeling that you're both aligned on a number of things. Well, let me just begin. Media inflation has been high for the last few years. Upfront inflation was at record levels last year. So what would you both say is the outlook for the current upfront negotiations and for next year overall? Manuel, do you want to start with the upfront?
Would that be good? This is more US, so let me start with that. Yeah, we saw a very, very active market last year where the networks had the priority to increase pricing. But it wasn't just increased pricing, it was also aligned pricing between the streaming impressions and the linear impressions. For a very long time, streaming impressions had been, back in the day, a fraction, a third, or a fourth of what the linear impressions were. So now that the linear impressions are going down even more, there was a real interest by the networks to revalue or bring that to parity between linear and streaming, so that they can also have the flexibility to move the commitments that they cannot fulfill on the linear side because ratings have been going down over years, and fulfill them with the streaming impressions, which are more readily available and keep on growing.
Interesting. And I have a feeling we're going to get back to that. I just wanted if Caroline would address that more general question about what you think, Caroline, is the outlook for next year overall.
I think you need a crystal ball for this probably. Yeah. But as we all know, we came from a very complicated and difficult 2020 with COVID and lockdown. 2021 was a dramatic, perhaps overcorrection of 2020. And what we're now seeing is high volatility. There's great uncertainty. I think, the combination of the war in the Ukraine and the impact that's having on raw materials and also items like steel and aluminium, plus also the COVID pandemic post problems in terms of supply chains. There are a lot of issues here. And I think we're probably also facing, unfortunately, a financial downturn globally. To what extent, we don't know.
Yeah, and just as a follow-up, what we're seeing a lot of clients do now with the upfront, but this is a preview of what may happen at the end of the year with the calendar year negotiations, is that clients want to have as little money committed and flexibility to back out of those commitments as well. So back to the upfront in the US, one thing that we're seeing now happen is that the networks right now are not so much interested in raising prices anymore because they already accomplished that last year. They're now interested in locking up the highest possible share of the budget for themselves and leaving as little negotiation to back out as they possibly can get away with. So that's a big fight this time. It's not so much pricing, it is making sure that they have the money locked in. But we're seeing a lot of volatility. What we thought was going to be inflation maybe even 6 weeks ago, it looks very different today, and it might look very different 6 weeks from now.
It's extraordinary that things can change that quickly. I remember during COVID, for example, when everyone was scurrying to, dare I say, pivot, people were saying that long-term planning was suddenly becoming 2 weeks. So it sounds like there's something similar with this level of volatility. Let me ask you something a little bit more specific, because it seems that not every country is experiencing the same level of media inflation. Could you just shed a little bit of light on some of these differences, or maybe just give us some other examples? I know that, Manuel, you've mentioned a little bit about the US. Caroline, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think what complicates it is the different countries have obviously different factors that influence them. It's partly how the media is traded. It's also to do with media consumption and also advertiser demand. So in countries where we've got, in countries where we've got advertiser demand coming back again, that's pushing up the prices. Then we have a situation where we've got audiences migrating away. Audiences came back to TV in the lockdown, they're going away again. So we have less audience, we have higher demand here. We've also got audiences migrating away from what in other parts of the world we call mainstream or terrestrial television and moving into things like cable and satellite. And also the young audiences are highly inflationary. I mean, I think the young audiences, we're losing them pretty much for good now, at least in terms of regular broadcast TV.
Yeah, when you look at generational factors too, yeah, go ahead, Manuel. I'm sure you have some other comments.
What we're seeing is that the demand is very uneven across categories, across sectors. So you're seeing some of the packaged goods still continuing to increase budgets or hold them, and some other categories, for example, here in the US, automotive and some others are not growing or even shrinking. So how it all nets out at the end, it's all a big supply and demand game, particularly here for the upfront in the US. The theory has always been that all the money gets used up eventually and that all the impressions get sold eventually. That's not the case everywhere. There are places where that doesn't happen. But here in the US, therefore, they're trying to play the game of trying to lock up as much money, gather, keep as much of it in the upfront. But then the question is what's going to happen with the scatter market later. My sense is that depending on the economy and how many of the options to cancel get exercised, you might see a really strange inversion there where the scatter may turn out to be cheaper, but that's it's hard to tell at this point.
No, I can certainly imagine, because there's also, just to emphasize what Caroline had said, there's so many other factors going on in toward the latter half of the year in the US, including elections or midterm elections and so on. So who knows? And particularly with the kind of inflation we're seeing and some of the supply chain issues. So who knows? Just while we're on the topic of geography, I just have another short question, because I'm kind of curious. Do regions, whether it be Europe as a whole or Latin America as a whole, do they kind of behave as a group when it comes to media inflation, or are some countries quite different?
No, I mean, if you take, the European big 5 or 6 markets, they're different. And again, it's to do with the fact that each country in Europe is a very different country in terms of media consumption, in terms of what's available there. One of the things that we're also seeing here is inventiveness on the part of the media vendors who are building in hidden inflation. So, for example, you will find there is inflation for different spot lengths, or you will find that there is inflation for different programs. So you really have to start to investigate very deeply behind what the vendors are actually selling here.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it also depends on the politics and the economic situation. Let me give you an extreme case. Argentina. Argentina right now, the inflation at the market level, not media, is going through the roof. And country next to them, Chile, for example, is not experiencing that. So there are wide variations. So I don't think you can generalize about regions. Each country is, and again, I think Caroline is right. Depending on how it's traded, it will change. It'll be different. But again, this year is going to be a crazy year. And 2023 negotiations are also going to be very tough.
So what's the expression? Buckle your seatbelt then, huh? No.
Yeah.
I think we're going to get to a couple of recommendations for seatbelt buckling. But we've talked a little bit about geography. I'm now and a little bit about specific media, largely with television. Now, what about digital media? Is inflation for digital media behaving in the same manner as other media? Can you provide any additional insight on the inflation differences between certainly streaming and linear TV? You have mentioned that, but I'm curious about digital in general, since we hear so much growth in the category.
No,
Yeah.
Digital is not one thing. It's many things. And for example, at least in our experience, I think display is dying or should be dead. I mean, when was the last time any of you clicked on a banner that wasn't an accident? No one really does anything with that. It's just background noise. Where we're seeing the action is in two areas. We're seeing video being a huge category that's growing. And that is, again, because audiences are migrating to streaming platforms and are now behaving very differently. So advertisers also want the flexibility that the digital buys for video provide. In most places, you can cancel that right away. I mean, you have 2 weeks IAB, 2 weeks policy to cancel things. Whereas for television, if you have a yearly negotiation, whether it be upfront here in the US or any yearly deal in any other place, you end up with money locked in and you have a lot less flexibility. So flexibility, again, is driving the move from an advertiser point of view, but the audiences are clearly moving in that direction. The other place where we're seeing inflation is on social. And that also is demanding, higher pricing, but also advertisers are moving there because that's where especially younger audiences are going to be.
I think where we're seeing sort of the inflation here is in the countries where we've got what we call connected TV now, so smart TV. And obviously then it's becoming very important to be able to measure this correctly. So we're seeing inflation in connected TV because it is finally properly targeted television here. And I think we're still seeing less TV in, if you like, the classic online, even in videos, than we are seeing on regular terrestrial television because of the problems of terrestrial television with audiences migrating. So because of the dual function here of television, there still is plenty of demand for regular TV. And with the audiences going down, we're still seeing higher inflation there in many cases than on digital. And I think many advertisers keep saying people need to leave regular television, but you have to look at who the big advertisers are on regular television. It's the Amazons, it's Google, it's Facebook, it's the e-com companies as well. So there is still quite high inflation. They're relatively high, I would say, in many cases than digital.
Well, the other one in digital is mobile. You're seeing, depending on the country, and this is an interesting point, countries are in different stages of their path to converting into digital. Some countries are much more advanced than others. But then there's two paths that we're seeing. Some countries are going to be very, very focused on mobile because that's where the audiences are. Particularly in Asia, we see a lot of that. And whereas here in the US, you see a more balanced approach where people still want a replacement for television for their advertising.
I would agree with that. I mean, China probably is one of the most advanced digitally in many respects, although measurement still falls behind. But I believe also, Manuel, you probably know more about this, but in Latin America, there's a lot of inflation in social media, isn't there? Because it's a highly successful medium in that continent.
Yeah, especially for younger audiences.
Well, you never know when those younger audiences get tired of looking at small screens. We'll have to see what happens next. But I have a general question for you. Why does media inflation always tend to outpace overall market inflation?
I'm not sure that's necessarily true. I think it's just a big game that's being played in the industry. It has been higher in some cases, but what happens is, again, to the issue of semantics and definition. What is media inflation? In some places, you hear the rate card change year on year as quoted as inflation. That's meaningless. A piece of paper or a website with a rate card can be manipulated in any way, and then of course you get an 80% discount off of rate card. Rate cards are meaningless. So that's one thing that you need to make sure that you're not looking at. But then we see two other types of figures quoted, and clients also very interested in knowing both. One is, what was my inflation on negotiated rates before they get booked and optimized? And then what ultimately happened, the actual inflation that happened at the end of the day. And what we see here, and again, US as an example, is we're seeing that people are saying, oh, inflation is going to be 15% like last year. It ended up being less once it got negotiated. Now, of course, the agency says, look, I deserve a medal because I went in and I negotiated down from an expectation of 15 down to 11 or whatever the case may have been. And the fact of the matter is everybody got 11 or pretty much or something in that range. And then at the end, when they book everything and optimize, it might be 9 or 7 or 8 or whatever the case may be, and you get it down again. So I don't think the gap is as wide as it seems to be. Now, there are some areas where inflation has gone crazy. Television here in the US in a few years, for several years, has been going up. And again, it's supply and demand. Less impressions, money keeps coming in. But not everything is going up at that rate. Now, is it still higher than regular inflation, than consumer inflation? Probably so, but not by as much as people make it out to be.
Caroline, what would you say about that?
Well, I think it depends. I think sometimes people also mix up inflation trends with advertising spend trends, which are not necessarily the same thing. So what is true is when you have high, more or less confidence in the financial markets, more or less market inflation there, the advertising trend will always exaggerate it. So if the financial markets pick up, advertising expenditure tends to go up more, and vice versa, because it's one of the easiest items to cut for a marketer. Now, people then mix that up and they forget that's only part of the inflation piece. And then there's the rest of the inflation here. So I would say that I broadly agree with Manuel. However, we have some markets that are extremely inflationary. The UK is very inflationary at the moment. Some aspects in Chinese media are very inflationary at the moment. Some parts of Indian media are very inflationary. So it does depend a little bit on the countries.
And also, for each individual advertiser, where they came from is very important. I just had a client call me like last week and say, hey, my agency is telling me my rates are going to double or almost double. This is a high inflation country. And we said, well, how much are you paying right now? And their rates were so ridiculously low that even if it doubles, they're still ahead of the market. So they're going to see higher inflation than the rest of the market because many vendors are trying to get some discipline into the market, into the pricing, and they're going to get hit very bad. But again, it's where you're coming from. Now, if you're already paying at market levels, you probably will just ride the wave with everyone else.
I wonder if these are just truly unusual times without necessarily a precedent in the past. I mean, obviously, we've been through inflationary times before, but you talked about 2021 following COVID as being a dramatic overcorrection, and that now we're facing this volatility. And we start to wonder, in light of changes in markets, changes in media consumption habits. I mean, it's got to be one of the hardest times to predict anything.
Well, and the other issue is these tend to be self-fulfilling prophecies. When someone starts talking about inflation being very high from the very beginning, and it just becomes the narrative in the industry, guess what's going to happen at the end? Because the advertisers will pay more. Agencies, let's face it, agencies don't really have an incentive to keep pricing down. If anything, they have an incentive to grow budgets. What they do want is to be a little better than the person next to them. But they, in general, they have no incentive to do that. So you get this narrative, and then of course advertisers get scared. They want to minimize their risk, even if it costs them a little bit more, and inflation happens when perhaps it didn't need to happen.
Any comment on that, Caroline?
No, I think I would broadly agree with that. That yes, I mean, there's a lot of talking up of the inflation in the industry.
Well, then maybe we should shift to something else that's related, and that's measurement. Because there's certainly some new measurement systems that are now competing with established players, whether it be Nielsen, and obviously how things are measured also, affects people's perceptions of inflation and so on. Do you want to comment at all about the state of measurement now?
I think the problem is that there's only partial measurement everywhere. I don't know, we can measure bits of the different media, we can measure aspects of the different media, but it's not all pulled together into one. And we're not talking now just about inflation, we're talking about the audience measurement as well, which is what we need to calculate the inflation. But I think this is something that is not harmonized at all, almost in any country. I think we've got a few bright points on the horizon. I know in the UK there's going to be at least some form of being able to integrate connected TV into regular measurement, and we're seeing that maybe one or two other European countries, but it's still a long way behind where it needs to be, and the industry, as always, is slow in measurement.
Well, and measurement is expensive, and that's the other issue. These are very, very large investments that need to be made to get things going. So I agree. The issue has been that there have been this, but also there's another issue. The basis upon which one media gets measured is different. So the currency is different. So you can't just add it up. It's a little more complicated than that. And then, of course, the big issue of reach and frequency. How many people am I really reaching, and what's the frequency? And am I overlapping, and by how much, and how much money is being wasted as a result? We're still a long way away from this. And here in the US in particular, we're seeing a lot of competition to try to take away Nielsen's business. Problem is, in the end, agencies and broadcasters as well. Broadcasters have more money to move around, but the agencies are going to be very tight with their budgeting, and they'll buy one at the end. They may do experiments on 2 or 3 along the way, but at the end, it's going to be one. And you can't be having, and this is another issue that's happening with negotiations now. Some of the deals for upfront are being done on alternate currencies, but most of them are being done on Nielsen. Now, if you did it on alternate currencies, how are you going to measure it and put it all together? It becomes a little dicey. And again, the investment is quite steep. So we'll have to see where this nets out.
You might recall, Manuel, they had that situation in Spain a few years back when they had two different television audience measurement systems. It was untenable. Eventually, there was one, because you can't have two.
Interesting. Very well. Here's perhaps the heart of the matter, really. How can advertisers then shift the power balance in their favor during negotiations to mitigate some of these issues, whether it's measurement, whether it's inflation?
Well, to me, it really is having more information than the other person. And also the other thing that you need to have in your back pocket always is a substitute. So can you walk away from something or minimize the investment in a certain type of media because you have an alternative? And people don't do enough homework up front, and when they show up at the table, it's like, oh, I'm very good at negotiating, I'll figure it out, or I'll just beat them up until they lower the price. But I think a little bit of homework up front pays off handsomely.
I think probably it's also two things. I think partly it's doing the homework, and I think that's very much for the agencies there to actually, I think I said much earlier on, the games the vendors will play in terms of where they bury the inflation in the rate cards and in the way they're selling, and the agencies need to look at alternatives to this, so different spot lengths, different station combinations, and so on. And I think the other one also is in how the advertisers manage their agencies and actually tasking them to mitigate inflation. So the agency should be given an objective here, which is to mitigate some, all, whatever the agreement is between the advertiser and the agency as far as inflation is concerned.
Yeah, we started the conversation saying that this was a contentious topic, that inflation was a contentious topic. Okay. And the reason why it's contentious is because it's tied to agency compensation and agency performance, because of exactly this, of the mitigation that is expected. So are you mitigating from a 50% from a figure that was inflated 100% to begin with? You end up where you should have been. And so therefore, having accurate inflation estimates and then having a realistic expectation of how much can be mitigated is key to having a long-term plan. And these advantages are cumulative. They compound over time. So it's not just doing it right one year. It's having a multi-year plan, to manage this. And even, for example, we've advised clients to set themselves up a given year by giving up something so that the following year they can take advantage of something else and not weaken their position that locks them into something that is going to hurt them long term. Problem is that advertisers, for the most part, are very short term in their thinking, and that always hurts. That always hurts.
It also depends a little bit, Manuel, on the setup. If you've got a monopoly or a duopoly in markets, your options are much more restricted. We're going to have some big problems in France going forwards with the merging of TF1 and M6, for example, and that's going to cause problems in the French market.
Yeah, and again, look for alternatives. If you don't want to go into television, what are you going to do instead? Some large advertisers have no choice, and the people always talk about how having lots of clout will help you in your negotiation. Sometimes flying under the radar is much more effective. We've had instances where large advertisers have been told, I can't give you that price, and we know that another smaller advertiser is getting a much better price because it needs to average out for the media vendor. If they reduce the price on something marginal, it just averages out. If they reduce the price on something that is very large and a large part of their share, it brings the result down. So again, size is not everything.
Yeah, exactly the same for agencies. The big agency groups don't necessarily have the best deals.
Yeah.
That is very interesting, and it's interesting because it seems to run so counter to what we would assume, which goes back to always doing your homework and looking for alternatives. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about in terms of what you might see on the horizon that would affect media inflation or perhaps any other concerns to media?
Well, let me fill the silence here. I think we're going to be seeing a crazy year in negotiations, and we're going to see a wider dispersion in pricing as a result. Some advertisers are going to end up paying more than others, even though they're trying. What we're seeing from media vendors is trying to get some price discipline into the market. Because they just want to grow their shares, they're probably going to give up on pricing just to lock in the money. And we're going to see wider price dispersion. So there are opportunities out there. Yeah, and again, do your research up front, have alternatives available, and hold firm. Hold firm with your agency, hold firm with the media vendors, and then be careful not to overplay your hand. If you go too far, you might get burnt.
That sounds a little easier said than done. Go ahead, Caroline.
And I was going to say, and I would also say that people have to look for different currencies to calculate their benefits in. I think while I wouldn't for one moment dispute the importance of CPM and so on, I think we also have to think, what are you paying to deliver what kind of an outcome? And I think there's not enough work done by agencies and advertisers in terms of saying, what are we prepared to deliver a certain type of outcome? The newer players to the market, some of the e-com companies who do advertise quite highly on television, have a completely different approach to this. And they have a different negotiating tactic. I also think that although advertisers might be tempted to cut back now in the recession, or the recession that will come, I would say, do remember they come to an end, because we know from the past that you shouldn't restrict your spending here. And that's, I think, proven by so many people. And I think Manuel's put it very nicely, do your homework.
Yes. Any other advice for advertisers before we sign off? So we've got certainly do your homework, realize that continuing to advertise throughout a recession matters. Think about alternatives. Anything else to add to that?
Well, hold firm. Don't get scared.
Yeah.
We see a lot of people just trying to, again, minimize risk in the short term, and it always ends up costing more as a result. Yeah. So hold firm.
Well, good advice. And I think what we're going to have to do then is we're going to have you back in a couple of months. If things are as volatile as you say, and if they're changing as quickly, then I think that we've got to take another look as we approach the fall and with year end in sight. And let's see if the needle has changed or if attitudes have changed. I think it would be interesting to keep this going on a regular basis, perhaps quarterly, just because things do wind up making a difference very quickly.
I agree.
Well, thank you both for sharing so much information, and looking forward to continuing. The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal